Second point, looking into the future, was volatility. Now, there are many measures, but this is a measure looking from the Chicago futures markets of volatility, and I think there is no doubt that volatility is now much higher than at any time in the last 30 years. And this is an issue for everybody in the supply chain, but it's an issue on both sides of agriculture. We often think about the volatility of output prices, but it's also on input prices. If we take just something as simple as the dairy industry, for instance, where purchased inputs may now run at, 8-9 pence per litre, with an output price of 25 to 30 pence. And that input price is varying by 50-60% in a year. Volatility has become a big issue in the risk that supplies. And I think here there are going to be potentially both industry and individual solutions that are going to be needed over the next 10 years. New futures markets, potentially. And we're already seeing that in America. We're seeing it in Europe. It is an issue in the UK. We're not seeing new futures markets over here. We have the exchange rate risk, of course, to think about. New supply contracts. And I think maybe the UK might be leading the way in this area in terms of thinking of innovative new supply contracts and how we can think about the risk that is shared within the supply chain. Government intervention, safety nets and the like, something that's been talked about. But certainly greater visibility and working together across the supply chain, because volatility doesn't just impact at any one node in the supply chain, it affects the whole supply chain. And certainly from the people we work with, it's people at the food industry end that are worrying about it just as much as people at the farming end. And that really brings me to the third point in terms of issues that I think are going to become more important. And that's about creating and capturing value. And my question is here, is there a new area that's starting for food prices and for the food industry? We've all heard and probably bought into, I think, the sort of John Beddington argument about the perfect storm. Big increase in food demand over the coming decades, increased demand for energy, increased demand for water, all at a time when there are constraints on resources and climate change to deal with. Now, this was something I think that in the food world quite often was seen maybe as a CSR issue. But something I think that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years that's had a big influence is that this is starting to be reflected in markets. If you went back from 2007 backwards, for many decades, not just the last 20 or 30 years, food prices, raw material prices, were falling year in, year out in real terms. And that really was the basis upon which the strategies in the food industry were built. I think increasingly, with the different peaks that we've had, the 2 big peaks we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years in the food industry, a lot of companies are coming to the belief that actually moving forward from here, that decline's not going to happen. And actually, we may even see the opposite, and rising food and commodity prices into the future. And I think that is slowly seeping into the strategies that food companies are adopting, and particularly the procurement strategies. Food companies have a supply challenge. Basically, whereas they weren't necessarily in the past, they're becoming much more concerned about security of supply. Can I get the quality, the quantity, and consistency of supply that I need into the future? I think even more at the moment has been around stability and the volatility that have suddenly entered markets. How can I budget, and how can I protect my margins? And in the longer run, the issue of sustainability, the fact that we have finite resources, water, oil, the constraints on those things, and the issue of climate change. And I think all of these things are slowly leading some food companies to alter the way that they're trying to procure their raw materials. And on those challenges, if we take the security of supply, I think a number of people are moving more towards long-term supply arrangements. Longer-term supply arrangements with a greater focus on reducing waste and increasing supply chain efficiency. In terms of price stability, trying to move to a situation where that risk is managed across the whole of the supply chain. And in terms of sustainability, well, that has to be done across the whole of the supply chain, because as we know, 50% of climate change emissions are at the farm level. And what this is pointing to slowly, I think, is an increasing value opportunities arising at the interface between farming and food in a way that just didn't exist if you went back 15 or 20 years ago into the early 90s. But those are opportunities that require a more strategic and collaborative approach to unlock them. Where I just wanted to go towards the end here was just to pick up 3 case studies of 3 different groups of farmers that we've been working with in the last 4 or 5 years, and 3 food companies that we've been working with alongside them, trying to create and capture value for all of those people within the supply chain. First one is with United Biscuits, a food company that probably most famous for producing McVitie's biscuits, I think, but are also big into snack foods. McCoy's Crisps being one of those. We've worked now for a number of years with United Biscuits across a number of commodities, but this particular story is in the potato sector, where there were concerns around the security of supply of potatoes coming from abroad and into their facilities within the UK. The route we went down was trying to get a group of farmers that would come together to supply their northern facilities in the locality around those in Teesside and put them together in a structure whereby they could work together, guarantee a supply into the food company, and also come up with a contract that would try and look at sharing the volatility and the risk between the two parties in this particular equation. And I think now, where we're seeing the tonnage starting to increase, I think it is a positive story after a number of years of this being in place. And it's one where you have United Biscuits a bit more confident about their security of supply, and you have the farmers a bit more confident about their ability to invest in their production into the future. A second example, another well-known brand, is that of Coleman's mustard. When I first came across this, I was quite surprised, really. I just assumed that mustard going into English mustard would be English. But of course, that isn't the case. And in fact, not only that, but the proportion of mustard going into English mustard was becoming less and less, as people didn't really work for them growing it over here. Similar sort of approach, really, getting together those growers left who were willing to grow English mustard, getting them in a structure, a new business owned by them, as in the case of the potatoes, where they could put some sort of quantity together that would satisfy the customer and give him confidence that he was going to have security of supply into the future. Also getting to the stage now where those people are thinking around, can we invest into storage? Can we invest into other sorts of value added, such as drying, for instance? And that brings me on to my third one, which has probably pushed us that little bit further. Third example of a group of farmers in the cereal sector. It's one of the groups that we've worked with longest. Cam Grain, I'm sure there might be some members here today. Cam Grain, group of farmers down near Cambridge. This was a business that was already there, started in the early 1980s, storing grain for farmers, but a business that has grown significantly over the last few years. And now not only doing the main thing it's there to do, which is to ensure that it can lift farmers' grain quickly and efficiently at harvest, but also getting to a place where it can now turn to the market, turn to customers and say, we've got a tonnage of grain. We're not only just based actually near Cambridge now, we're starting to spread across the country, and we can guarantee a certain tonnage of a certain quality at a certain time. Going through vendor assurance, adding value by putting in wheat cleaners. And I think probably while there's a number of contracts you could talk about, the key, most high-profile one being the relationship now with Sainsbury's, where all of the in-house bread in Sainsbury's is coming from this one group of farmers. 3 examples, I hope, which tried to show that we can talk about farming and food changing the nature of the relationship from a little bit, I think, from when I was perhaps at the end 15 years ago of the us and them to a food and farming stronger together. And I think all those 3 examples try and show the sort of sustainable competitive advantage that can come from working together. And in our view, what we've kind of learnt from working with a number of groups over the years are these sort of 3 things. The first one being getting a set of commercial objectives that everybody in the supply chain can actually agree upon and work together towards. And I think the really positive thing here is that the commercial objectives of food companies and farmers are starting to align themselves much more closely than they perhaps did in the past, when subsidy was much more important in farming and when food companies always thought there'd be another supplier down the road if they needed to get their supply from somewhere. The next stage in that then is a recognition on both sides of a mutual dependency in a relationship. And I think it is definitely both sides. You can always get stories, I might well get some in questions, where it didn't work, somebody reneged, it was the food company, it was the farmer. There are always those stories. But the learning of that mutual dependency is, I think, a crucial stage in this process, because that leads potentially to the supply chain integration, which is less about talking about price all the time, which I think traditionally perhaps where conversations have been, and much more about talking about how do we do the job better. I was asked to talk around the future and farming and think around what the business challenge was. I'd have to say that I've been 25 years in the industry now, Marek, And I would certainly be more positive about the future of agriculture at the moment than any time in the 25 years that I've been in the industry. It doesn't mean that there aren't dangers, and I've tried to highlight some of them through the course of the talk. And nor does it mean that we can be complacent. To deliver a higher profitability for UK agriculture in the next 10 years than in the last, the big micro drivers, what happens to prices, what happens to foreign exchange, what happens to interest rates, are probably still going to be the biggest factors that will influence that. But at the end of the day, there's not a lot you can do about that. It will be what it is. But the micro drivers are becoming, I think, really important for individual farmers and groups of farmers. And the great thing is, you have complete control, or a lot of control over most of these things. The ability to increase productivity, the ability to manage volatility, and the ability to secure the best markets and to try and extract the maximum value from them. I think farming is in an excellent position to lead what I tried to term earlier as perhaps the resource revolution. I think food companies are waking up to the fact, really, that for many years, raw material prices have been declining, and focusing on labour, improving labour and capital productivity was a way to success. Focusing into the future on resource productivity, I think, is going to become really, really important. And there, in my view, lies the golden opportunity for UK agriculture, because that is the opportunity for farmers and farming to deliver that resource productivity to food companies and to share in the success by doing so. Thank you.
Can I say thank you very much, Sean, for that extremely positive message. You talked about the roller coaster ride of farm incomes from 1990 on, and it highlights not just the volatility in commodity values, but the volatility in net farm incomes. You touched on exchange rate, the importance of the pound to the euro in particular to us as farmers. I was delighted to pick up the graph where it highlighted in the early 1990s 150%, how you get 150% of one's income I find difficult, but how that's been halved to 75% through direct support over the last 25 years. And you highlighted the importance of research and development. But it's the collaboration that you talked on security of supply, which I think most people would pick up on, the supply chain issues, the need to build those long-term relationships, and for us to have that sustainable competitive advantage going forward. And the word collaboration came into your vocabulary as well. So thank you very much, Sean, for that. Can we now move on to a real farmer, a farmer with very much mud on his boots, Mr. Robert Law. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Robert. He farms nearly 4,000 acres in Hertfordshire, Essex and Cambridgeshire. It's a mixed farming enterprise with 2,500 breeding ewes, combinable cropping, and he's involved in 17 environmental schemes. Robert is a first-generation farmer. He is vice chairman of our NFU Sugar Board, a former Oxford Farming Council member, and he was the Farmers Weekly 2006 Farmer of the Year. And I have to say, I had the privilege last summer of being taken around Robert's farm, and I can assure you everything looked absolutely fantastic. Robert, over to you to give us your presentation.
Well, thanks very much for that, Marek. Ladies and gentlemen, I must thank the organisers of this conference for inviting me along to speak today at the Business Challenge session. I think it's the first time ever I've sort of stood up at one of these conferences, and I've actually had myself beamed on the back wall here. And last Saturday lunchtime, I was just packing up my rugby kit to go and play rugby Saturday afternoon, and my wife said to me, "Going to say, whatever you do, don't go and pick a black eye up this afternoon." And it's really good to see here as well today some 150 young farmers who've joined us, something that this new venue has allowed us to do. It's 30 years ago since I embarked on my farming career, choosing to study agricultural marketing and business studies at Harper Adams. Thinking at the time my opportunities in practical agriculture would be limited, and the course in business studies would always stand me in good stead. Looking back, how useful this course turned out to be, especially having spent the sandwich part working on the other side in the supply trade. After leaving college and having a year's travel, I then went to work at Thrift Farm. Having been a working farm manager at Thrift Farm for a couple of years, I was then given the opportunity to go into partnership with a landowner. As usual, I grabbed at this and then thought about how I'd do the logistics later. Now, being in partnership with someone over 40 years older than myself brought its own problems. Despite his stated intention to take a back seat, this never ever happened. He started his farming in the 30s behind horses and always had a favourite expression, in the 30s when things were bad. But in a way, he was progressive. On the first day of the partnership, he handed me the checkbook, saying, "Boy, the quickest way you'll learn is by your mistakes." Now, at that time, the income stream of the farm was pretty straightforward. It was just sheep and grain sales. And I very quickly had a reality check. Soon afterwards, at the start of my first harvest, I was preparing the combine one Saturday afternoon for Monday start. Suddenly, there was a downpour. Nearly 2 inches fell in less than an hour. It devastated the spring barley crops, smashing them to the floor. After a salvage operation, I estimated we had left about 150 tonnes out in the fields.